My name is Jonah, and I am 42 years old. For 12 long years, I opened the order ledger every single morning before the sun cleared the rooftop. Rows of red roses and white lilies filled the columns. People came to my shop for weddings and funerals, trusting me with every important date on the calendar. Roland never once trusted me with anything more than trimming thorns. "You just arrange the stems and let the adults handle the books," Roland said. He said it every single week without a hint of doubt in his voice. I wiped the counter with a damp cloth and nodded. A cardboard hatbox sat dusty under the counter, waiting for a purpose it had not found yet. The numbers in the back office never quite matched the receipts sitting on my desk. I swallowed the insult and kept my pen moving across the ruling lines. Some people build their entire lives on the assumption that quiet men will simply stay quiet forever. They forget that a ledger always balances in the end. Please stay with me. Subscribe to uncover the contents of that worn cardboard hatbox. Drop a comment and tell me where you are listening from today. This remains a patient accounting. It is a slow settling of accounts rather than any loud dispute. I worked the columns in the shop. Every invoice had its place. Every receipt balanced down to the penny. The pages held the truth. You will want to stay for how the numbers finally aligned themselves on the heavy oak desk. Each day at dawn, prior to the sunlight cresting the brick barrier across the tight lane, I worked behind the counter. The shop belonged to a quiet rhythm of stems and water. My job was simple. I trimmed the roses and recorded each bundle in the blue ledger. Roland always stood by the tall window with his coffee. He liked to check the figures twice before the delivery vans arrived. "We have always managed the accounts with absolute transparency," he told me once. I nodded and turned another page. Every column matched the inventory down to the last green stem. The order book taught me a specific way of watching people. A florist sees every apology, every sudden grief, and every anniversary that almost slipped away until the 11th hour. These pages held the exact dates when local families bought lilies for a sudden funeral or orchids for a quiet reconciliation. I stayed focused and relied on the calculations the columns never lied. Each entry balanced perfectly against the next. Rules in our house were never written down on paper. They lived in the heavy air we breathed around the old kitchen table. Roland knew every single clause by heart. Lena accepted them because questioning the unspoken code brought too much friction. Every morning began with the same heavy sense of expectation. We operated under a specific unwritten code. In the Miller household, what was preserved through quiet ledger work belonged by public decree. It belonged to whoever spoke loudest about family duty while contributing nothing to the cost. Roland stood by the counter with his coffee cup. He tapped the ceramic surface with a fingernail. "We have always managed the accounts with absolute transparency," he said with a completely straight face. I looked down at my green ink and my neat columns. The numbers were exact. Every single receipt matched the physical inventory in the back room. Roland did not care about the math. He cared about the performance of ownership. He loved the theater of responsibility without any of the actual labor. Lena sat near the window and avoided my eyes. She traced the grain of the wood with her thumb. "We have to keep the peace among us," she said quietly. Her voice was thin and tired. That was her constant refrain whenever Roland took charge of something he did not own. Peace in our family meant letting Roland claim whatever required someone else to bleed. I said nothing in response. I simply closed the blue cover of the book. The silence in the shop felt heavier than any ledger entry. The flower shop required a very particular kind of patience. Roses needed fresh cuts every morning at dawn. Tulips demanded cold water and clean vases. I spent 14 years tending to those stems while keeping every financial record balanced to the penny. Roland never trimmed a single thorn. He only appeared when money changed hands or when someone important came to visit. He believed his loud voice constituted a major contribution to the business. That belief sustained him through every single month of doing absolutely nothing. People in Olwe knew us as a solid family enterprise. They saw Roland smiling at the front counter. They assumed he built the business from the ground up. I remained in the background where the real work happened. My desk was piled high with invoices, dockets, and bank statements. None of those visitors ever asked to see the receipts. They trusted the loudest voice in the room. Roland played his part with absolute confidence. He wore the authority of a founder while possessing none of the underlying facts. The ledger remained my only true companion through all those years. Every entry told a true story about local weddings and quiet funerals. Old ink tells stories that people prefer to leave unsaid, I sometimes whispered to myself. Roland certainly forgot every anniversary that mattered. He only remembered the calendar when profit distributions arrived in the mail. The system worked because I let it work. I kept my head down and trusted the columns. That trust formed the foundation of the coming reckoning. The shop door opened with a sharp rattle of brass bells. Roland walked into the front room of the store. He wore a heavy wool coat that smelled of damp pavement. Lena followed closely behind him carrying a stack of delivery slips. She kept her eyes directed entirely toward the floorboards beneath her boots. The bitter winter wind rushed through the open doorway while they stepped inside the warm shop room together this morning. Roland dropped his leather gloves onto the wooden counter near the register. He looked around the room with a practiced air of ownership. He inspected the glass vases and the rows of ribbon spools. He reached out and touched the corner of the heavy oak desk. Every single shelf in the room seemed to bend slightly under the heavy weight of his demanding gaze this hour. A worn cardboard hatbox sat quietly on the high shelf above the desk. He did not look up at it while he spoke about the upcoming spring inventory. We have always managed the accounts with absolute transparency, he said. Lena nodded without raising her gaze from the delivery slips in her hands. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Her fingers trembled slightly against the crisp paper edges. Several old business documents rested carelessly beside the brass register while he checked the time on his prized heirloom piece. Roland pulled a silver pocket watch from his vest pocket and flipped the metal cover open. That grandfather's watch had belonged to our mother's side of the family. Roland checked the dial before snapping the cover shut again with a loud click. He tapped his knuckles twice against the surface of the counter. The morning sunlight slanted through the front window and warmed the dust motes. Bright golden rays of morning sunlight traveled slowly across the polished wooden floorboards near the front display window area today. Lena murmured something quiet about the morning orders that needed sorting before noon. Roland ignored her and walked toward the tall shelving unit by the back wall. He ran his palm along the edge of the blue ledger resting there. The pages were filled with ink entries detailing every rose stem and ribbon purchase. He turned the book slightly to check the column alignment. Every single row of numbers inside the thick book had to satisfy his demanding personal standards for absolute financial accuracy. He expected everything to conform to his strict expectations without question. Lena stood near the doorway and waited for further instructions from him. She twisted the corner of her apron between her fingers. She rarely offered a direct opinion when Roland was in the room. Her compliance was total and predictable. Quiet obedience remained her only real protection against the sharp edge of his endless public criticisms during every family meeting session. He liked the arrangement that way, because it required no complicated explanations or adjustments. I watched them from the sorting table while I trimmed thorns from a bundle of stems. My hands moved steadily through the work. I did not interrupt their conversation about the ledger columns. Countless delicate rose petals fell silently onto the dark wooden surface, while I continued my quiet floral preparation task today. The shop remained quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. Every entry in the book mattered to the final balance at the end of the month. Roland closed the blue book with a firm motion and slid it across the wood. He told Lena to bring the remaining invoices into the back room immediately. She complied without a single word of hesitation. She gathered the scattered papers into a neat stack against her chest. Heavy boot footsteps echoed loudly against the bare floorboards as they walked away toward the enclosed storage area together now. She followed him out of the main room without looking back at the desk. The bell above the entrance chimed softly as the door swung shut behind them. I stood alone in the quiet shop with the scent of damp greenery. The cardboard hatbox remained undisturbed on the shelf overhead. Fragrant, fresh floral scents filled the empty store space, while the quiet afternoon hours began to stretch out slowly ahead. The daily routine resumed its steady rhythm in the empty room. Every receipt waited patiently for the final tally to prove its own accuracy. The blue ledger waited on the counter for the next entry. I picked up my pen and opened the cover. Every single page within the bound volume recorded the quiet passage of time through flowers and ledger numbers alone today. The columns stretched downward in neat parallel lines. Patience remained the only tool truly needed for the work. The afternoon light cut across the wooden counter like a blade. Roland stood near the front display with his coat buttoned tightly. He tapped a leather glove against his palm while looking down at the blue ledger. I stood behind the register and waited for him to speak. He cleared his throat and looked right at me. "You are falling behind on the basic mathematics of this business," he said. I kept my fingers flat on the wooden surface and stared at the grain. The shop was entirely quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator in the corner. Lena walked out from the back room with a stack of green wrapping paper. She stopped near the doorway and watched Roland with a cautious expression. Roland pointed a finger at the open columns in the ledger. "Every single entry must be justified by your own hand before the weekend arrives," he said. I nodded slowly and said nothing to defend the hours I had spent trimming stems. Flowers remember the dates people choose to forget, I thought silently while looking at the rows of red roses. Roland adjusted his collar and walked toward the tall front window. "You have never understood how a real enterprise operates under proper supervision," he said. Lena dropped her gaze to the floorboards and shifted her weight from one foot to the other. She placed the green paper on the side table with a very soft sound. I watched the dust motes drift slowly through the shaft of afternoon sunlight near the door. Roland tapped his glove against his leather briefcase and checked his watch. "The margins in this book are completely unacceptable for a shop of this size," he said. I reached out and touched the edge of the blue cover with my fingertips. The paper felt rough and familiar beneath my hand, after all these years of careful work. Lena cleared her throat and stepped closer to the counter to rearrange the display. "We always try our best to keep everything balanced according to your instructions," she said. Roland turned around and looked at her with a cold and unforgiving expression. "Your opinion was not requested in this matter," he said. Lena stepped back into the shadows near the back room without another word. The silence in the room stretched out while the clock on the wall ticked loudly. Roland closed the ledger with a sharp sound that echoed off the glass display cases. "You will correct these figures before tomorrow morning or face the consequences," he said. He turned and walked out through the side entrance without looking back at either of us. I stood alone behind the counter and stared at the empty space where he had been standing. The pages of the book fluttered slightly in the draft from the open door. I picked up my pen and stared at the ink marks I had made earlier that day. Every column was neat and precise down to the final green stem. I did not raise my voice or argue against the injustice of his demands. I simply reached for the next blank line and prepared to continue my work. The sink in the back room drained slowly into the rusted iron pipe. Water pooled around the steel rim. I wiped the porcelain counter with a damp gray cloth. Nobody came back to ask for help with the morning orders, leaving me entirely alone with the heavy silence. I placed my pruning shears inside the wooden drawer. The metal clicked against the surface. A pair of wire cutters followed. I needed a different place for keeping my personal items now that my old desk had been reassigned. Lena walked past the doorway carrying a bright bundle of yellow ribbon. She paused for a single breath near the sink. "I am just sorting these supplies," she said. I nodded slowly without looking up from my workstation, and she hurried toward the front counter. The faded blue cardboard hatbox had belonged to my mother years ago. Dust rested in the small creases of the lid. I lifted it down carefully from the high shelf. The old cardboard container felt light and empty in my damp palms when I pulled it down. I carried the box to the corner table. The wood was bare except for a small jar of pins. I placed my brass house key inside the container. It made a distinct metallic sound against the rough cardboard floor that echoed through the empty back room. Roland's voice drifted back from the front of the shop. He was speaking to a delivery driver about crates of white carnations. The tone was sharp and absolute. No mistakes would be tolerated on his watch while he remained in charge of the daily ledger accounts. I reached into my pocket for the small pocket knife I used for trimming stems. I laid it beside the brass key. The hatbox swallowed the items without complaint. Everything I needed to keep from the shop was migrating into this strange cardboard receptacle day by day. The shop hours stretched forward without my participation. I trimmed stems of fern and green baby's breath. I arranged them in plastic buckets. The water was freezing against my skin, and nobody asked for my opinion on the new pricing structure. At 6 o'clock, Roland locked the front glass door. The deadbolt clicked twice in the frame. Footsteps approached the back room threshold. Roland stopped precisely at the edge of the worn linoleum floor and looked at me with flat eyes. "Make sure the counters are clean for tomorrow," he said. I nodded once at the white wall. He turned away without waiting for a proper answer. I went straight back to the faded blue hatbox waiting on the bare corner table in the shadows. I placed a receipt book stub inside the box. The paper was crisp and white. I shut the lid softly. Exile was not a loud or dramatic event, but rather a simple box closing in an empty room. As the sun sank beneath the commercial buildings on the opposite side of the road, the interior became dimmer. Shadows stretched across the concrete floor. I pulled a wooden stool closer to the dark corner, sat down, and stared at the faded blue cardboard edges. No one would come back to check on what I stored in this receptacle. The ledger accounts belonged entirely to Roland now. Every single financial calculation was his burden to bear, and I felt a strange sense of quiet weightlessness settle in. Lena's footsteps tapped against the floorboards near the front register. She was locking the cash drawer for the night. She did not say goodbye before she left. The heavy front entrance door clicked shut with a hollow and final sound as she stepped out onto the sidewalk. I remained alone in the back room with my thoughts and my small collection. The hatbox sat quietly on the wooden table. Our mutual silence left no room for further discussion. The ledger records were gone, but the quiet human habit of keeping things survived inside me like an ember. The gas heater clicked on in the corner. Warm air puffed out across the linoleum. For the concluding moment, I set my palm against the lid of the hatbox. The worn cardboard felt coarse and well-known beneath my fingers while I outlined the perimeter of the rim. Tomorrow would bring another set of flowers. Another delivery of red roses and green ribbon. I would cut the stems and place them in water. I would keep my own private counsel and watch from the very outer edge of the shop operations. You are still listening here. I appreciate that. Sitting near the back sink, I wonder if you have ever been pushed away from records you kept for years. Have you ever watched someone else take the pen while you maintained the shop? Tell me in the comments if you know that specific weight. Drop a small note below. We will see how steady those new columns remain when the true seasonal balance finally arrives. The written pages will always catch up in the very end. The calendar on the wall changed 4 times while I worked behind the back counter. Winter frost iced the lower panes of the tall windows. Spring brought bundles of yellow daffodils that required careful trimming. The afternoon light shifted across the dust-covered floorboards in slow amber bars, while the delivery trucks idled outside. I kept my own journal inside the faded blue hatbox. Every delivery slip stayed fresh in my memory. Roland signed the front office receipts with a thick black pen. He never checked the bottom drawer where my notes accumulated. Years passed in quiet repetition. Lena walked past the work table on a rainy Tuesday morning. She carried a bundle of green ribbon for the spring rushes. Her hands shook slightly as she placed the scissors down on the zinc counter. She stood there for a long moment while the rain beat a steady rhythm against the glass panes of the front door. I asked her if the new invoices matched the ledger totals. She did not answer me right away. She looked toward the front office where Roland was talking on the telephone. "We always have to keep the peace around here," she whispered softly before turning away. I did not say anything back to her. I only reached for a clean sheet of paper. The ink bottle sat on the corner of the wooden desk. I dipped my steel nib into the dark fluid every single evening after closing time. The numbers told a story that nobody else bothered to read. Every mismatched column pointed toward a gradual erosion of the business. Roland assumed that silence meant approval from everyone in the shop. He grew bolder with each passing season. His handwriting filled the blue ledger with figures that bore no connection to reality. I turned the page and recorded the actual inventory anyway. The discipline required absolute patience and zero noise. Customers came and went through the heavy front entrance. Some of them ordered red roses for anniversaries that arrived year after year. Others bought white lilies for quiet funerals. I remembered every single date without needing to look at a calendar. Time carved lines into my face while I stood by the back sink. The daily routine became a sanctuary of small tasks. I trimmed thorns. I swept green stems into the metal bin. I watched the margins slip away under careless management. The records grew heavier month by month inside my hidden storage space. Nobody asked about the math. Nobody suspected that the numbers were watching back. The blue binder grew thick with extra pages. I added cardboard spacers to keep the spine intact. Roland rarely looked at anything except the top summary sheet that arrived on his oak desk every single Monday morning. He trusted the totals because they matched his spending habits. That winter was exceptionally cold. Ice froze the pipes near the wash basin. Lena brought a portable space heater into the back room. "You should take a break from those columns," she said softly while plugging it in. I thanked her and kept my pen moving across the ruling lines. Spring returned with heavy rains that soaked the cardboard delivery boxes. I stacked them neatly by the back door. Every single yellow receipt went straight into its proper pocket, inside the worn leather binder resting under my workbench. The accounting system required absolute silence and steady hands. Roland walked past me with his silver pocket watch in his hand. "Are these figures ready for the accountant?" he asked without stopping. I told him they were nearly finished. He nodded and walked out to his car. Years piled up like fallen leaves in the alley. The heavy blue ledger slowly became a complete and entirely unalterable history of the local flower shop's steady decline. I recorded every missed payment and every inflated supply cost. The truth did not need a loud voice to survive. It only required ink and paper. I closed the cover and slid the book back into the dark shadows. Another quiet season approached without any warning. The blue ledgers rested on the lower shelf behind the counter. The weight of $14,000 hung over the final totals like a heavy fog. Roland stood near the window with his hands deep in his wool pockets. He stared out at the gray pavement of Olwyn. Traffic moved slowly past the glass front. "We have always managed the accounts with absolute transparency," he muttered to the empty room. His voice lacked its usual sharp edge. It sounded tired and thin. I watched him from the back alcove near the sink. He reached out and touched a display vase of red carnations. His fingers brushed the green stems with surprising gentleness. For a brief second, he looked less like an absolute ruler and more like a man who lost his footing. The thought surprised me. I kept my fountain pen resting on the wooden board. The shop was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigeration unit. Roland pulled a folded paper from his breast pocket. He smoothed the creases against the edge of the counter with a slow motion. His shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. He looked down at the column of figures we printed last Monday. Something in his posture shifted. The rigid certainty seemed to drain out of him all at once. He did not look up when Lena walked through the side door. She carried a crate of yellow ribbons and placed it by the copper scale. She glanced at Roland with a cautious expression. "Are the supply costs bothering you today?" she asked quietly. Roland let out a long breath through his nose. "The numbers do not line up the way they used to," he admitted to the empty space between us. It was the closest thing to an admission he ever made. "My mother always told me that business requires a steady hand," he added after a moment. His voice dropped into a lower register. He did not mention our grandfather or the old ledger rules. He simply stood there in the dim afternoon light. The illusion was beginning to fray at the edges. Every column he defended so fiercely now demanded proof he could not provide. $14,000 was a steep price for a false sense of control. The ledger pages turned over in my mind like dry leaves. Roland walked back toward his small desk by the front register. He sat down in the wooden swivel chair. The wood creaked under his weight. He did not pick up his gold pen immediately. He just stared at the blank page before him. I remained hidden behind the partition in the back room. The seed catalogs on the shelf pressed against my spine. My private notebook stayed secure beneath the heavy paper stacks. Lena walked past my alcove without stopping. She wiped her palms on her canvas apron. The tension in the room felt thick enough to touch. Nobody spoke another word for the rest of the afternoon. Roland pulled the ledger closer and opened the cover. The paper made a dry scraping sound against the mahogany desktop. He picked up his pen and dipped the nib into the inkwell. His hand hesitated above the blank line. The pen did not move for several long seconds. He looked at the empty space where a receipt should have been filed. The silence stretched out between the front counter and the back sink. Outside, the evening wind picked up a few loose autumn leaves. They skittered across the concrete sidewalk with a sharp scratching noise. Roland rubbed his forehead with his left hand. His wedding band clicked against his temple. He looked older than 45 years in that fading light. The system he built was cracking right down the middle. Every ledger entry from the past 4 years seemed to point toward this exact afternoon. I watched him struggle with a simple addition error on page 42. He erased the mistake twice before getting the sum right. The small vulnerability did not change what had happened. It merely made the architecture of the lie visible to anyone willing to look. Flowers remember the dates people choose to forget, I thought to myself. Roland closed the ledger with a soft thud. He turned off the desk lamp and stood up from his chair. He walked toward the front exit without locking the inner door. Lena watched him leave from her post near the cutting table. Neither of us said goodbye as the front bell chimed softly. The shop settled into the deep chill of an Halloween evening. I stepped out from the back alcove and walked to the front register. The blue book lay open where Roland left it. I looked down at the incorrect sum he tried to fix. The discrepancy stared back at me with absolute clarity. My fountain pen felt heavy in my breast pocket. Tomorrow would bring another set of invoices to review. The ledger would wait for me on the shelf. The blue boxes stayed hidden beneath the workbench. Every receipt proved the gap grew wider each month. You understand how heavy it feels to carry proof while someone else pretends the book's balance. Have you ever waited for a ledger to speak for itself? Tell me down below. The winter cold pressed against the glass front of the shop. Roland still believed his pen was the only law that mattered in Olwing. He still had no idea what was resting just inches from his boots. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning. It rested on the wooden counter near the back sink. Roland brought it himself. He wore his heavy wool coat. His gold ring clicked against the wood. He dropped a formal letter beside my notebook. The paper bore his signature at the bottom. The ink was dark and heavy. He demanded total submission regarding every ledger entry. He wrote that our operations required immediate correction. He claimed sole authority over the missing funds. He spelled out his entire method on the page. "You are wrong about how the business runs," Roland said. I kept my hands resting on the desk. The hospital waiting room smelled of antiseptic and floor wax. Lena stood near the doorway. She held a small paper cup of water. Her fingers trembled against the plastic rim. "We need your signature on this document," Lena said. I looked down at the formal letter. The text laid out every single fraudulent transfer. He had signed his name above the printed date. $14,000 appeared in black print. He accused me of concealing the deficit. He put his own guilt directly into writing. "You signed your own name to the math," I said. Roland frowned at the paper. He adjusted his gold pocket watch. He stepped closer to the small desk. His breath smelled of bitter coffee. He tapped the paper with one finger. "The oversight belongs entirely to your department," Roland said. I turned another page in my private notebook. The blue ink showed every transaction clearly. The $14,000 matched his written confession. The records proved who held the pen. The paper in his hand sealed the entire matter. Lena looked away from us both. She set her paper cup on the small side table. The room remained completely silent for a long moment. Roland cleared his throat with a sharp sound. He expected me to argue or raise my voice. I did neither of those things. Silence was a better tool than anger. The formal letter rested flat against the wood. Every sentence he wrote worked against his defense. He had overreached in his attempt to secure absolute control. The written evidence bridged the gap between suspicion and certainty. No one could talk around a signed document. The hospital lights flickered once above our heads. Outside the window, gray clouds drifted across the sky. Winter had not yet released its grip on the town. I closed my personal notebook with a quiet snap. Roland picked up his envelope and checked the fold. His fingers moved with a sudden nervous energy. He knew something had shifted in the balance of power. Lena kept her eyes fixed on the linoleum floor. She recognized the weight of what was printed there. Neither of them expected the ledger to talk back quite like this. The paper stayed on the desk between us like an anchor. We waited for the doctor to return from the hallway. Nobody spoke another word about the business or the accounts. The hours ticked past on the wall clock above the door. Every column of figures stood ready for the final tally. The paper proved everything without a single raised voice in the room. A strong odor of thick floor polish and chilled linoleum permeated the emergency department lounge. Plastic chairs lined the pale walls under flickering fluorescent tubes that hummed with a low, steady vibration. Outside the high window, gray sleet tapped steadily against the glass. I placed my canvas bag on the small laminate table between two empty chairs. Inside sat the blue notebook and the receipt stubs collected over 3 bitter winters of absolute silence. Roland lay down the hall behind swinging double doors, recovering slowly from his sudden physical collapse. He expected a simple, formal resignation and a quiet exit from the town he controlled. He did not expect 12 years of columns to follow him into a sterile room. Lena walked through the sliding entrance doors with a small paper cup of water. Her wool coat was damp from the sleet outside. She stopped near the vending machine and looked down at my canvas bag. She set the water cup on the table with a sharp click against the plastic. "I brought these old bank slips from the farmhouse desk," she said softly. She reached into her deep coat pocket and laid a small stack of yellowed slips beside my bag. "Your dual records correspond completely," she remarked, staring intently at the ground. Her digits quivered faintly upon the synthetic counter. She did not look at me while she spoke. For 3 long years, she had watched Roland alter the daily tallies from the farmhouse kitchen table. She never stopped him, but today she brought the missing proof without asking for anything in return. "You should take these inside to him," she whispered, stepping back toward the exit. She did not wait for an answer before turning away. Her small act of honesty changed nothing about what I had to do, but it shifted the weight in the room. I opened the canvas bag on my knees. The blue notebook lay beside the faded blue cardboard hatbox that once belonged to our mother. Inside the hatbox rested the grandfather watch with its heavy gold chain coiled like a sleeping snake. Roland had carried that watch for a decade, as a badge of absolute authority over every ledger in Olwyn. Now it sat quietly among old receipts and torn slips of paper. I turned the stiff pages of my own record. Every single column matched the missing $14,000 line by line. The door at the end of the corridor pushed open with a quiet squeak. A nurse in blue scrubs walked past carrying a plastic tray of medicine cups. I stood up slowly and adjusted the strap of my canvas bag. Roland was awake now, waiting for the paperwork to clear. I walked down the linoleum hallway toward his hospital room. The ledger was heavy against my side. I pushed the heavy door open a few inches further. Roland lay against the white pillows with his eyes closed. The room smelled of antiseptic soap and old lint. I stepped inside and pulled a metal chair close to his mattress. He opened his eyes slowly and stared at the canvas bag resting on my knees. "You brought paperwork instead of flowers," he said, his voice dry and raspy against the quiet monitors. I laid the blue notebook across my lap. The pages were thick with ink and marginal notes. "This is not paperwork," I told him, keeping my hands flat against the stiff paper. 12 years of ledgers tell a very different story than the one you mailed me last week. He tried to sit up higher against the pillows, wincing slightly as his shoulder brushed the metal frame. "You always worried too much about columns and fractions," he muttered, looking away toward the narrow window. I reached into the canvas bag and pulled out the faded blue hatbox. The cardboard was soft at the edges from years of damp air in the back room. Inside rested his gold pocket watch on its heavy chain. He kept that watch in the shop drawer while he rewrote every invoice in Olwyn. "Flowers remember the dates people choose to forget," I said quietly, setting the watch down on his bedside table. He stared at the old gold case without reaching out to touch it. His fingers twitched once against the white sheet. Lena stood quietly by the doorway in the hallway outside, holding her empty paper cup. She did not come in to rescue either of us from the arithmetic. She simply brought the missing slips from the farmhouse desk and left them where they belonged. "I verified every deposit against these pages," she said softly to the floor before turning away down the corridor. Roland looked back at me with tired eyes. The absolute authority he carried in the shop had vanished under the hospital sheets. "You think this changes anything about the family?" he whispered, coughing lightly into his fist. "I don't care about the family," I told him, closing the blue notebook with a sharp snap. "I only care about the math that finally matches the truth." The canvas bag rested squarely on the floorboards beside the wooden counter. Inside it sat the blue notebook and my mother's cardboard hatbox. Roland could not survive another public audit. Everyone in Olwyn knew the shop accounts were hopelessly broken. I held the precise figures for the $14,000 he misplaced. I could walk directly to the local bank and place the complete financial records right on the manager's polished oak desk. They would lock his front doors before sunset. The temptation crossed my mind like a shadow over the floor. It would be effortless to let the system crush him. He built the trap with his own hands. Revenge has a distinct cost. It demands too much breath. I wiped the copper scale with a clean cloth. The brass needle settled slowly at 0. Roland was broken already. He sat in his hospital room staring at blank white walls. Pulling the final legal threads would only drag me into the same exhausting machinery that consumed him for years. Taking everything from him would change nothing about my own quiet mornings. I left the canvas bag untouched on the shelf. There was no victory in watching a desperate man lose his livelihood. Lena walked through the side door. She carried a stack of fresh paper wrappers. Her hands trembled slightly against the green paper. She set the fresh green wrappers down slowly on the zinc tabletop and waited for the other shoe to drop. She looked at the canvas bag near the corner. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Nothing happens at all," I said. She exhaled a long breath. The tension in her shoulders finally eased. It was unnecessary for us to pursue the upper hand. The shop remained ours to run. The ledger entries would return to my hands tomorrow morning. No speeches were required. No dramatic declarations echoed through the back room. The heavy silence in the back room stretched outward until it finally filled every single corner of the front showroom. I picked up my pruning shears and trimmed a stem of yellow roses. The metal clicked softly in the air. I placed the blossoms into a glass vase. The math balanced itself without needing a single drop of malice. The blue order book waited on the desk. I walked to the back shelf. The blue notebook went back into the dark recess beneath the seed catalogs. The hatbox slid back under the workbench. Let him keep his title. Let him keep his pride. I always had fresh spring flowers to trim and several urgent orders to pack before the afternoon delivery truck arrived. Restraint is simply another kind of bookkeeping. You balance the ledger by knowing when to close the book. Some accounts are better left unsettled. Let the past remain where it belongs. The afternoon sun warmed the glass panes above the sink. Tiny particles of dust floated leisurely amidst the bright slanting afternoon light that poured across the surface of the scarred wooden table. I reached for a bundle of crimson carnations. Each stem required a clean diagonal cut. My fingers worked with practiced rhythm. The work itself provided a steady anchor. I did not need vengeance to make things right. The daily routine was enough. The front bell rang softly as the door opened. A customer stepped inside with a hesitant expression. I walked out to greet them with a calm and steady smile. The front bell rang softly. Lena pushed the glass door open slowly. She carried a small brown paper parcel tied with yellow string. Her wool coat was unbuttoned at the top. She set the parcel beside the zinc sink. I lingered over my trimming shears, while the air smelled of damp stems and fresh eucalyptus water pooled slightly around the brass drain. Lena untied a piece of rough hemp twine with cold fingers. She placed our grandfather's heavy gold pocket watch on the counter. The metal caught the light from the overhead fixture. "He will not be needing this for a while," she said quietly. I wiped my damp hands on my heavy apron. The ticking of the timepiece filled the space between us. It was steady and measured. She had polished the heavy brass casing until it shone brightly under the glowing bulb. "You should keep it on your desk," Lena said. I shook my head slowly. The gold chain remained coiled beside a stack of blank order sheets. Our grandfather had carried that watch through 30 years of Olween winter storms. It belonged to the shop now, in a quiet and permanent way that nobody could undo. Lena adjusted the strap of her dark leather handbag. She did not mention Roland or the sterile hospital room. She only looked at the green ledger resting near the back shelf. We both knew the accounts were balanced at last. She turned and walked back out into the afternoon street without another word. I picked up the watch by its heavy ring. The ticking beat against my palm like a small, steady heart. The missing funds remained a ghost in the front office, but the back room stayed quiet. I laid the timepiece beside my pruning shears and went back to my station. Orders arrived by 3 o'clock in the afternoon. A customer requested a dozen yellow roses for a golden wedding anniversary. I selected the stems with absolute care. Every thorn was stripped away before the ribbon went on. The brown paper wrapping was crisp and white. The ledger page lay open under the gooseneck lamp. My pen moved across the ruled lines in a straight line. No entries were missing from the sequence. No columns were altered by a yellow pencil. The ink dried slowly, without a single smudge to mar the margin. Outside the shop window, townspeople walked past on the gray pavement. Nobody stopped to look inside. The streets went about their business without noticing the small shift in gravity. That suited me just fine. I preferred the work itself over any public speeches or grand gestures. The grandfather clock in the corner struck 4 o'clock with a heavy thud. Its chime was deep and resonant. My fingers made contact with the glass dial of the golden timepiece. It rested securely among the tools of my trade. The room was entirely still. The brass key hung securely on its familiar iron hook beside the door. The long day was finally done. The accounts were entirely clear. You see how quiet things settle when the daily work is finished. I walked across the aged timber boards toward the front counter as the morning breeze chilled my skin. You might wonder why I chose not to keep the proof hidden safely beneath my wooden workbench for another difficult year. I carried the faded cardboard box right between her hands. Lena looked at the lid without speaking a single word. Keeping it would mean holding onto a heavy debt that no longer belongs to my accounts. Every blossom holds onto the exact time someone needed it most. Some memories stay buried in the dirt until another pair of hands unearths them. I pushed the heavy container forward across the polished wood. Lena took the weight into her own grip and held it securely. Her fingers closed around the cardboard edge. The worn box left my fingertips entirely. It rested safely inside her waiting arms right now. You can leave your own city behind whenever you decide the ledger is finally finished.